Hi, Alyse. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm delighted to have you as part of the I'm Awake Now What podcast alumni now. So I always give my guests the opportunity to introduce themselves in their own words. We will summarize this episode in more detail when we go into post-production, but why don't you tell the people watching and listening who you are and what you do?
Okay, so my name is Alyse Bacine. I'm a spiritual mentor and I have an expertise in trauma and breathwork. I started learning breathwork at age 19, and so about 23 years ago, and I have been teaching and sharing it ever since. I also was a school counselor for 10 years, so I have a master's degree in counseling psychology. And, worked as a school counselor for over a decade. And then at the end of 2019, I just had a very strong nudge, that I needed to do more. I
Mm-hmm.
knew for a long time I was meant to do more, but in 2019, it was really like, okay, let's get on with it. So I started my business. I thought it was initially just going to be me doing breath work with people, and it just evolved into a lot of other things. And now I specialize in helping people heal trauma, discover their purpose, and create businesses.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Well, and my second question is always like wanting to understand everybody's early entry into spirituality, religion, or nothing at all. And then like, what are you grounding yourself in as an adult? I'm very curious about that journey for everyone who comes to the show. So what was that like for you?
That's an interesting question. So I actually was raised Jewish, but my mom was raised Catholic, and she actually converted because my dad wanted me to be raised Jewish. Jewish people always want the kids to be raised Jewish. So I did have a part of my family that was Catholic, but I was raised Jewish, and where I grew up in Philadelphia, I was around a lot of Jewish people. So, it was kind of like a natural thing. So I was raised Jewish, I was bat mitzvahed, and it's interesting because I identify as Jewish culturally, like my kids are being raised Jewish and all of that, but I never really connected with it as a religion. It was just more where I felt like in my blood, I'm Jewish, but the religious aspect of it, I just never really connected with it. I always was just much more spiritual. Even, as a young kid, I would see visions and I would like have these out of body experiences. So I've always been super just connected spiritually since I was a child. So spirituality has been something that just naturally was me since the beginning. So yeah, it's interesting having that kind of juxtaposition of like, I'm Jewish, but I also, from a religious aspect, don't really feel that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really cool. I mean, and it's almost like if you already came into this life knowing that you didn't need a container because you were already spiritual.
Yes, exactly.
Plus, you didn't have to, it doesn't sound like you had to unlearn anything. So that's always great if you can like skip that step.
Yeah, no, I didn't really. It's interesting. Like I learned stuff, but it wasn't anything that kind of stuck with me or that
Hmm.
I had to contemplate or anything.
Yeah, yeah. Well, beautiful. Well, I'm excited to unpack all of your work. Thank you for going into that detail of that question. The place that I thought we would start was actually with trauma. So, this podcast is the intersection between spirituality, healing, and personal development. So, anyone that's listening to this or watching this or invested in this work is already doing the work of healing their trauma. So, I wanted to talk about, like, as a baseline for other questions, like, how do you define trauma? How do you see it working in people's lives, whether they're conscious or unconscious of it? Why don't we start there? And then I've got kind of some more specific questions about ancestral trauma and things like that.
Okay, cool. So the way that I define trauma is any situation or experience or an experience over time that was too much for you to process and overwhelming to you on an emotional or a mental level. So you couldn't fully process it. And trauma is a matter of perspective. So, when I was a school counselor, I would always say there could be two kids who grew up in the exact same environment, same parents, same household. One can present as very traumatized and one can present as completely well adjusted and not really having an issue with anything. So it really is about your perspective and kind of the way that you perceived a certain situation. And then the way that it can show up for people is a lot about the way that we internalize experiences and then create decisions about ourselves and the world based on those experiences. So, what a lot of what I do with people is helping them disentangle from their relationship patterns with their parents. And then also what I call birth story, which is your experience from conception up until 3 months old, and how what was happening while you were in the womb and right when you came out created like an energetic imprint and a lens through which you see the world. So I help people disentangle from those three things first, and then figure out what decisions they made about themselves, like I'm not good enough, or there's something wrong with me,
Right.
or abandonment, or feeling rejected, and all of that. And then noticing how those things show up in their current relationships, and then showing them how they can actually use their current relationships to heal those things from the past and start to show up differently, and then be able to create what they want in their lives.
Yeah, thank you for going into that level of detail. I think that's a really robust explanation. And I wanted to give people sort of something to hang on to as we go deeper into this line of questioning. So I'm very much invested in healing our lineage and ancestral trauma. And I think those two things, it's like a Venn diagram, right? Of ancestral trauma and healing your lineage. They technically are not the same things, but they have some overlap. I wondered when the work that you're doing, helping people just even see their ancestral trauma, number one, but then also addressing it. What does that look like when you're trying to help somebody do that? And then two-part question here. How does that help their lineage?
Yes. So the way that I see it is, you're right. They're different. The family trauma and the ancestral trauma are different, but there is a lot of overlap. And I like to actually start with the familial trauma, because what we'll notice is that a lot of the ancestral trauma will actually show up in the family trauma. So when we start to disentangle from the family trauma and we really start to dissect that, and we start to shift and heal from that, a lot of the ancestral trauma will shift and change and heal just from that. However, there will be stuff that won't. And the way that it's different is, the way that I see ancestral trauma is, it's more of like these bigger energies, these bigger archetypal energies, these bigger patterns. So, the way that it could show up, for example, would be, when you're starting your business and you are going beyond what your parents did, right? So an example of this would be like, for myself, when I started my business, my parents, were both teachers their whole lives, and that was what they did. And then when I stopped being a school counselor and I went beyond that, there was a lot that I faced that was kind of holding me in place in, kind of doing what my parents did. And then when I went beyond that, I faced a lot of, fear of failure, or fear of, being in poverty, or not having enough financially. So those are kind of these bigger overall patterns of energy that can show up from the ancestral lines. So that's kind of the way that you can see it, is when you expand beyond what was done before you or what your parents did. And then, what I like to say to people too with ancestral trauma is, you don't need to go digging around for it. Like, when there's something that you need to shift, you'll know. It'll be right in your face. Like, it's not going to be something that you have to go figure out. So don't feel like, because I know when I talk about this, sometimes people are like, oh my gosh, I need to figure out what my ancestral trauma is. And I'm like, no, you'll know. It'll be right there in your face. But like I said, I do like to just start with the family stuff, because that will clear so much. But then as you continue to grow and expand, there will be elements that will show up that will feel like they are related to like these longer, deeper energetic patterns that go beyond just you and your family. And it has a different texture to it. And that's usually how you can tell the difference.
Yeah, that's a great example of what you said there with the teaching thing, is like, and I felt that too in my life as well. I did something very different. I sort of broke away from the pack, and the pack never wants you to break away. So, and it's so disorienting for yourself, but it's very disorienting to your current family, immediate family, or, whatever your system is. And I also think about, with the ancestral trauma, I also think about it in terms of like, it's kind of like what's collectively happening with the family. Like once you get on the other side of it and you have the consciousness to see it, from a removed place or a healed place, you can see everyone is suffering, but to some capacity with this like thread of ancestral trauma that sort of lives in everyone. And it's like, you have to just apply so much compassion to those family members and to your lineage, because not all of us can break away. Not all of us have this opportunity to do this. It takes a lot of work to get to wake up and get out of it. I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Well, it's interesting because as I've gone deeper and deeper into my own path and then teaching, I have a certification where I teach people these tools to heal from trauma and the breath work that I teach and all of that. And as I have just gone deeper and deeper into this, I've started to notice so many different components, of the ancestral trauma piece and the ways that we can take on traumas, from our parents, traumas from the ancestral line, and also even, memories of things that happened to them that can get passed on to you. And there's so many different ways that trauma can get passed on, like the extreme example would be, when somebody gets abused and then they abuse, another person. But trauma can even get passed on like that, but not in the form of abuse, but just as like if somebody was traumatized, they can actually just energetically hand it over to their kids in an unconscious attempt to deal with it. And I've seen that a lot too with a lot of my clients where, we're actually able to see the way their parents passed on different energetic burdens or traumas to them. And it would be hard to really know what that is until you kind of get underneath of it and see it. So there's so many nuances and components to it. I think just, that people aren't even really realizing or talking about. So I think we're like really just scratching the surface here of what really can get passed on to us and the levels of trauma that we're really being called to clear at this time on the planet.
Yeah. Yeah. My mom growing up, she used to have, I was adopted. So I'm talking about my adoptive mom here. She used to verbalize her fear about the world a lot. So when I was growing up, I used to have a lot of fear. And it was obviously, like you said, it was coming from some traumatic experience about the world that was unhealed and unprocessed in her. And although I wasn't experiencing that same trauma, her verbalizing the trauma made me traumatized, or, like I would call this a little t trauma, like afraid. And it was like, once I became, an adult and into my late 20s, I started sort of, challenging that fear, and really like facing it and realizing like, oh, she's just been very afraid for so long about really specific things. And she's passing that wonderful gift along to me that I'm going to give back to her. You said something back there that I thought was really important, that I think I feel like in terms of psychology, and therapy and development, is the idea of being a child in a family with multiple siblings and the parents applying the same teachings, parenting, but not realizing that like we are individuals and we're experiencing things completely differently.
Yes.
I wondered if when you think about working with people, I feel like I definitely have gone through this in my own experience as well, but for you with the work that you do, how important is it for you to validate that their experience is true and real? Because I feel like you can get gaslit in a family if there's not consciousness and healing.
Oh my God. Well, this is the most important thing. And I think this is a place that I start with a lot of people, is giving people permission to acknowledge their experience. Because what can happen for people, and I see this with almost everybody, and this is like probably one of the biggest traps or pitfalls when it comes to healing your childhood trauma, is when you are looking back at your childhood as an adult, it can be really easy to look at it through the lens of being an adult and look at it from an
Right.
intellectual, logical perspective and say, oh, well, even though that happened to me, I understand why. Like, I understand my mom was really scared or my dad wasn't there or whatever. So we can look at what happened and know intellectually that it hurt you, but you're looking at it from a logical adult perspective. So you kind of skip over the feeling experience of the child. And that can be really tricky because you think that you looked at it, you think you know what happened, but you didn't actually look at the way you felt as a child. And that is so important to spend time with how you felt as a child, even if it feels like it's going over the top or it's overly dramatic to you as an adult. As a child, something very small could equal I'm not loved or I'm not good enough or they don't want me or there's something wrong with me. And those feelings that we internalize are incredibly damaging and then can set us on a course for the rest of our lives, of feeling this way. So it's so important to acknowledge what your actual experience was as a child, regardless of what you were told about what it was, right? And I think that's like your point, where if you grew up in a home where everyone is kind of like, oh, well, this is the truth of what happened. This is what kind of parents we are. We've done so much for you. We've sacrificed so much for you, right? And then it's like, well, now I'm not allowed to feel the way that I feel because they've done so much for me, and that stuff can get really internalized and ingrained in there. And it can make it hard for people to even give themselves permission to fully acknowledge how they felt, because it feels like you're going against your family and it feels like you're kind of betraying your parents. And people can shy away from that and not fully acknowledge the pain that they felt, the suffering that they felt, the wounding that they felt, and then subsequently what were the decisions they made about who they are, what they deserve, what kind of place the world is based on that. So that's like, we have to be able to start there first.
I always think it's interesting too, when you do that work and you go back to those places, how our personalities become modified versions. And you kind of have that question of like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Because our personality is changing in response to our environment. And so some of that unlearning and breaking that patterning and like distilling down who you are to the core of your being without your family is such an interesting place to do work, because you recognize, like, again, we are all influenced, because we are evolutionary beings. We are influenced by our environments, whether we acknowledge it or not. And to pick that apart once you recognize and validate your experience, I think is a very interesting thing to do. I did want to talk to you also about, it's always important to talk about the romantic elements about, breaking trauma, dealing with past healing and wounding and all of that. I do want to save some space here for the people who are in relationships, working on getting into a relationship. Like, what do you have to offer for them about doing this work, or anything that you do with your clients that can particularly help them get into a better place with healing anything that is a barrier to having the relationship they want?
Oh God, I love this. I could talk about this all day.
I know this could be like a 2-hour question.
Well, because I just love breaking down relational dynamics and patterns to like what is actually happening underneath based on your childhood. So
Well, break it down, girl.
So one of the things I will say is that, I often will have clients come to me who are in relationships. However, they're like, should I leave this relationship? Like, this is not working. Should I leave? And I always will say to them, we're not even going to worry about that. We're not even going to answer that question, because that's not the question you need to ask yourself. We're going to go really deep into what happened in childhood. What was that core wound? What were the decisions you made about yourself and the world based on that? And then what were these energetic patterns you created relationally that's causing you to show up the way you are? And then once we shift that, it's really simple. Either their partner shifts right along with them and they start to relate to them differently, or they leave. And either way, they're happy because it's like what was supposed to happen, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to romantic partnerships, really all we need to do is do the deeper work so that you can start showing up differently and you attract somebody different, you know. And I have done all of this within my own marriage. You know, I've been married for 11 years and completely changed the dynamic of our relationship. So it's completely possible, and it happens. It's not even like you need to talk to the person or say anything, but it's when you shift internally, the other person shows up and meets you there, because they can't meet you anywhere else. Because if you are not available for certain dynamics anymore, then it's impossible for somebody to go into that with you. But what I will say about romantic partnerships, and for that person who maybe feels like they always pick the wrong person, or, you know, that type of thing, 100% of the time, we are attracting people in an effort to reconcile our wounding from childhood. 100% of the time.
Hard to agree.
So it's great because then you have the opportunity to do that. You just have to know how to navigate that, which is, you know, what I love helping people with, because a lot of time it can just feel like, oh, this is just, you know, I picked another like asshole or whatever it is, but that's really not what's happening. It is your opportunity to look at those pieces of you that were wounded, those decisions you made about who you are or what's available to you, and shift them. And then as you do that, the person you're with starts to change, or the people that come into your life starts to change. But we just have to know how to navigate that and how to understand what this person is reflecting back to you inside of the relationship and then inside of the dynamics that you have. And it's about really starting to be, I always tell people, patterns and parallels, patterns and parallels. We have to look at what are the patterns that keep showing up in every relationship. What is your core wound? And then looking at the parallels that happen with that inside of every relationship. And once you know what those are, it's very easy to be able to see and to be able to shift it. But you just have to know what those are. And sometimes it takes a lot of support, because once we get triggered, it's hard to be able to, I mean, even for myself, I teach this and I talk about this all day. And when my husband triggers me, I'm like, what's happening? And I do know what's happening, but when you're triggered, it's a whole different experience. So it does take, you know, a level of support to be able to get there. But if we're able to look at relationships as literally just an opportunity to heal from childhood and grow and know how to utilize it as that, then it becomes so much easier.
It really does. And we do overcomplicate things, I think, because we want the, like, there's something about our human experience where, like, I like a challenge and I want to make it hard. And and it's actually very simplified. And the wonderful thing about patterns is they repeat. So they're real obvious.
So obvious.
Very obvious. And it's like you said, you know, when you're, you know, dating the same person or the same circumstances are coming up, like, yeah, it's because it's a pattern, you know, like that's actually where all of the good stuff is. And I think to your point about being triggered, like, I think a lot of times when we're unhealed, we have this reaction to sort of run from the uncomfortableness of it. And, you know, but that's where all of, like, the good stuff is like confronting it. So, like, I don't know if you have any words of, like, you know, support for somebody who's, like, afraid to, like, see the thing, or, like, they keep getting triggered, but they don't want to deal with it.
Yeah, well, I would say to get some kind of support with it, because why would you want to keep being in a situation that doesn't feel good? But it's very important to have context for what's happening. And that's what I tell people all the time. It's like, listen, I'm giving you context. I'm letting you know here is what's happening. It's almost like you're stumbling down a dark path, and then I'm like, here, I'm turning on the light and I'm showing you where we're going. Like, this is what's happening. So to have context and understand what is happening and why, it makes it so much easier, because then you don't feel like you're stumbling around in the dark. and you don't feel like you just want to run because this is so uncomfortable and I don't know what to do about it. If you have context to be like, okay, this is my stuff with my mom that's coming up. I see that. This is the same thing that I felt inside of that relationship. My stuff of feeling like I'm not good enough or people pleasing or being hyper vigilant or whatever it is. That's what's happening right now. And if I can realize that's what's happening and then address my inner child, I always teach people like we have to address the inner child first, because when you're triggered, you automatically want to make it about the situation in front of you. And it's never about that. It's always about your inner child. So if we can go directly there instead of trying to figure it out through the situation, which usually doesn't work, we can go directly there and address what's truly happening, then it gets to shift a lot easier. So if we're aware of that, we can address the inner child. And then, I teach people how they can shift their energy beyond that. Then it really becomes a lot easier. But we just have to understand contextually what's actually happening versus what we think is happening.
Mm-hmm. And it takes a lot of time too. I mean, this is not something it's just like any practice you have. I mean, being able to understand the trigger, to acknowledge it, to understand its source, to go and talk to your inner child, and then create your own tools to, create some reconciliation there so that you can move forward. I think it's, since we've been doing this for a long time, like it's very clear, but for somebody who might not have been doing this, this is a practice like meditation,
yes,
like your breath work, like your exercise. It's a different practice. And I think getting out of that, I think that idea of intellectualizing everything, because when we are adults, I think that becomes like a protective mechanism that we have, because we can intellectualize what happened and not have to address the thing like you said. But that's where all the wisdom and like the power and the healing is, in those moments where you can like really get deep in there with your inner child and be like, girl, we're going to be okay. Let's do this.
Yeah. And it's alchemy, right? Because when
Yes,
you can feel the
1,000%.
feeling and transmute it, that's when you alchemize it. And that's when it's no longer there trying to get your attention all the time.
Yep. Alchemy is my jam. Um, I did also want to talk to you about, the money piece of things, about healing. So this is another layer of the work that you're doing, but is also related to how we feel about ourselves, the stories we were told, the cultural implications of how money was, taught to us or not taught to us as children. And then whatever piece of that is tied into our worthiness or our core wounding. So can you explain to the audience, like, why would somebody feel weird about money? And why would it be tied to something deeper than just like feeling weird about money?
Yeah. So, well, there's a few things. There's three main things I would say that I'm going to highlight that are very important to look at. One is just like cultural, societal programming around money. We are programmed to believe that money is finite, right? There's not enough of it, and we need to look at it from this like lack perspective. And it's also used as a tool to induce shame a lot. So I feel like people feel so much shame around talking about it, about their personal situation. And, shame is like one of the most, I don't want to say useless emotions, because I realize people feel shame and that's fine, but it doesn't get us anywhere to sit and shame about it. So if you notice that you have shame around it, anything you can do to shift that and just face it head on is very important. So there's that piece. The other two pieces are, one, I actually believe that money and our relationship to money is directly related to our mother wound or our relationship with our mother. And the reason why is because our relationship with our mother is our connection to life. It's how we perceive being living, right? Being connected to life itself and being supported in living. And that's what money is. It's supporting you in living. So I look at whatever you feel like you didn't get from your relationship with your mother. Usually we project that onto money in the form of expecting not to be supported by it, or feeling disconnected from it, or being afraid that it's not going to show up for us, or not trusting that it will. So it's really important to look at that mother wound when it comes to your relationship with money, so that you can, because the same way we look at the mother wound in how it shows up in our relationships, it's going to show up in the same way with your relationship with money. So if you can look at that wound and then notice the way that you're projecting that onto money and then shifting that relationship the same way you'd shift any other relationship, that's when we can really start to shift it. If you're looking at it as that relationship, and then what are you projecting on it, or what are you expecting from it, and then shifting that. And then the other piece that I think is really important to look at is around these larger past life imprints, or these archetypal imprints that have been imprinted on us. And, as I started to work with more and more women in growing businesses, I started to see that there were these bigger archetypal past life imprints that almost everyone had. And one of them is just this deeper fear, imprint, trauma around lack and scarcity, and essentially there not being enough. And, from lifetimes of poverty, not having enough, not feeling like you're enough, the fear of not having enough, it comes up for everybody, So looking at, where are you looking at life itself and money as it's not enough?
Mm-hmm.
And the fear of there not being enough, and almost this like survival fear of, what if there's not enough, and what if I don't survive? And that is very much imprinted on the collective consciousness. So the cool thing about this is that as we shift it, it really shifts the collective consciousness, not only around money, but just about how we interact with life in general. If we are shifting from interacting with life as, a fear of not being enough, or a fear of there not being enough, to knowing that, infinite abundance is truly who we are, and interacting with life from that perspective, it has an impact on the collective consciousness, the more and more people who do that. And then it becomes easier and easier to expand into that. So I think that that's a really important piece to look at around money, and just these bigger imprints that we have around that, that I see come up for all women, around like the fear of being seen, and, the fear of sharing your gifts, and all of these things. It literally comes up for everybody. So I think those things are very important to look at when it comes to money, so that you can change your relationship with it and continue, like we're saying, to have that practice of noticing when you are projecting these wounds on money, and then intentionally shifting your relationship with it.
Yeah, you said so many interesting things there that I think the listening and watching audience will have a lot to chew on. A few years back, I had a lady on the show named Haley Englehart. She wrote this beautiful, beautiful book about the goddesses. And I kind of never forget about her when I think about women and money, which is something I'm very passionate about as well. She talks about how way back in the day, because she answered the question of like, how was it that women sort of we got taken out of the economy at some point, but it happened a very, very long time ago, when the hunter gatherers stopped hunting, and the women were the ones who were seeding the fields and like doing all of the, like artistry work and things like that, while the men were out physically hunting large animals and things like that. But then you fast forward as to where we are in this current paradigm, and you think about how, a lot of us, our mothers, were still beholden to the idea that they had to be submissive financially to a man, or that they had to have their entire financial worth wrapped into his. And you think about just those two things, not even the other 2 points you made there. Just thinking of those two things that historically and culturally have happened to the feminine in this world, it's no wonder she struggles. And I also think, like, I know a lot of women who struggle with money, and there's also this idea of like, especially in the corporate world. So in my daytime job, I'm in the corporate world. And so I love helping women negotiate their salaries higher. There's a point where women will stop themselves and say, well, $150,000 is enough. Like, I don't know if I should ask for more, or I don't know if I should ask for $200,000. And it's like, absolutely not. we have to stop doing that. We have to stop capping ourselves off, because to your point, that creates that idea that there isn't enough. And it's coming from inside of us, from some story that was embedded and imprinted in us for so, so long. And if anything, to your point, like we women, the feminine, we're so beautiful and wonderful and creative. And we are literal, like we're a Gaia in her human form. Like we have access to everything. And deepening into that power is so important. So I love that you said all of those things back there. And I hope that it really helps, people listening to this, especially women.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's so many things, right? Like
It's so multifaceted and layered. But I think to your point, like unlocking one or all three of those things that you mentioned will push you forward, right? To get you to that place.
for sure. And I always say to people too, it's such a personal journey, because we're all so different and we come in to this life with different things, different challenges, different things that are
Right.
naturally easy or naturally, that we struggle with more. So I think it's such a personal journey too, of like learning things and taking things in, but then ultimately creating your own path with it and your own relationship with it that's different than anyone else.
Yeah. And the past life things, I kind of want to talk a little bit more about that. That's really interesting to me. I myself have never done anything like past life hypnosis or anything, but I know a lot of people that have, and we've had a lot of past life regressionists on here, and it's super fascinating to me. I do feel like I can access some of mine from time to time. Or if I have something, an obstacle or even a celebration that happens in my life, like sometimes it feels like not of this time. It's really, it's a very strange thing to think about. But when you think about the money and the past lives thing, what would be like a common theme that you would see that people are getting tripped up in this area? Because this I think is really interesting to sort of deep dive into.
Yeah, well, it's interesting too because I was never like a past life person either. Like, I'm not gonna be like, oh, you were this in a past life, so that means this. Like, that is not my thing at all. And sometimes I feel like people can get stuck in that too, of like,
Identified with it.
yeah, over identifying with it and being like, oh, well, because this happened in a past life, that's why I
It's
can't.
another story to create.
Yeah, exactly. So I never wanted to add that component to my work. However, over time, I started to see these more archetypal energies that literally every single woman I worked with dealt with, So one of them being the fear of being seen, which would look like, everybody, probably every single person. I think there might have been one woman I worked with who didn't say this to me, who says, I just hate showing up on social media, or I just feel like I don't know how to show up on social media all the time. And what I started to see is I'm like, this isn't actually about social media. This is actually about this fear of sharing your spiritual and psychic gifts and the fear of being killed or ostracized for it. Like, that's what's really underneath of this, right? It's not actually that you don't like social media. It is that you feel inherently unsafe showing up and sharing these deeper gifts that you have with the world because of these past life imprints. I literally saw that with everybody. And then I saw this lack and scarcity imprinting too, where it was like this, even if it showed up like not feeling comfortable taking money for their services, or just that uncomfortableness of, of doing that, or am I charging enough or not enough, or just the whole lack and scarcity energy around that, it literally came up for every single person. And then the other one that I saw a lot too is, this fear of, if I fully like show and express who I am, how it's going to make other people feel, like that they're not going to like me, or I think different from the crowd. So now people aren't going to like me, or I'm going to be ostracized, that type of thing too. And then what can happen is it can make us like water down what we're saying because we're afraid that people are going to, not like you anymore, or you're going to lose friends, or you're going to lose connections. And, it can show up for women in business when it comes to growth, it's automatically assuming that if they grow, they're going to lose something, or they're going to lose their relationship, or they're going to lose friends or whatever. So, there's that one. And then the other one is, this kind of like overall fear of something terrible happening, which is this, collective unconscious trauma, whether it's, war or a natural disaster or just bigger traumatic collective things that have happened. I see that come up for women a lot, where it's kind of, they're constantly like afraid that it's
catastrophizing.
Yes, or like they're going to lose everything at some point, So I started to see these overall archetypal energies that came up for everybody, which is why, I have a small program that I teach called Past Lives and Money, which is where I teach you how to recognize and clear these things, because I've seen them come up for every single person. So I like to look at the past life stuff through more of that archetypal lens that can actually be really helpful for people in maybe not recognizing where some of these challenges are coming from so that they can shift them.
Mm-hmm. And all of those ideas are so universal. They're so deeply embedded in generations. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of years here. And that third one you talked about, like, of the competition of elevating, and how, part of that is embedded in the idea of like, women have been taught for so long that they can't, be equal to men, or can't have like, a strong career without, at least sacrificing their marriage or their children. Like it's just so gross. All of it is just so gross. And so it's like, even the idea of other women, like that insecurity embedded in other women creates a sabotage in the women who elevate. And so being able to unlearn that behavior, unlearn that idea, and recognize that like the only way we're going to get strong as a gender and as a collective is if we break those patterns and start living very empowered. Because I actually feel like the feminine is way stronger than the gender masculine here in this world, and I'm sure I'll get some stuff for that, but I feel like it's purposeful that we've been pressed down in our power, and it's so critical that we remember who we are, and we remember how much power we have and how much agency and ability. And like, women are wonderful. Like, oh my God, they're just the most beautiful creatures that ever existed on this entire planet.
Seriously. And usually they're carrying like so much, like,
all the things,
their kids, like their business, like everything. It's like, and they're just like doing it.
Right. And then they're still saying like, I don't know if I can ask for more money, or I don't know if I'm smart enough to do that thing. And it's like, the resourcefulness, the resilience, the courage, and the general grit that is part and parcel of the female human experience here is so unbelievable. And I hope that women can lean on that, like see that reflected in themselves, so that they can know like nothing is impossible for you. And that's like everything, to your point about the abundance and the money. Like there's nothing that's impossible. And there's so many other like not, intelligent beings on earth that have less strengths, that are doing, collecting all of the coins,
Yeah, totally. And I always say that to women, because I feel like I have so many women who are like thinking they want to start a business, but they're like, I don't know, or I'm not sure like what I would do. And I'm like, no, you can, and you do know, it's just about, let's just like clear the trauma and get clear, but you can 100% do it. Like 100%.
Yeah. And validating that, like, there are still parts of this world that don't feel safe to be seen and to be heard and to be elevated. And that's real, but we have to do the work anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it does have a collective imprint on everybody as we do that.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to end it there because I think that's a great place for us to stop. So I want to give you some space here to tell everybody like what you have coming up, any speaking engagements, anything you've got going on in the next couple of months. This episode will air next weekend in a week's time. So I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, like I said, actually, I have a free training coming up on May 24th called Show Up on Social, where I teach you how to make one small energetic shift so that you feel comfortable and confident showing up on social media and sharing your gifts and have fun with it. Cause it's supposed to be fun. So that's completely free on May 24th. You can sign up for that on my website or on my Instagram, and I can share the link for that. And then I also have my program, Past Lives and Money, coming up in June, where I teach you how to shift those 4 major past life archetypal energies that can get in the way of growing your income and growing your business, and making it a lot easier to feel comfortable showing up, sharing your gifts, and being who you are inside your business. So that is really exciting too. And then I have a lot of stuff going on. There's so many different ways to work with me, but you can, check out my Instagram, Alyse_breathes. I also have a podcast called Reclaiming Consciousness. That's a great way to find me as well. And then my website, AlyseBreathes.com.
Okay, we'll definitely put all of that in the show notes. And we didn't even get to talk about your breath work, but I was very interested in the other things you do. So thank you for letting me ask you all of those questions. I always end in gratitude. So I always want to check in with my guests and sort of see like what 3 things are rolling around in their heart chakra today, this week, this month, this year. Anything you've got to tell the audience?
Gratitude. Let's see. Well, one of the things I'll say, I think, because yesterday was Mother's Day, my kids, my son who's older is getting ready to turn 10. And I'm like, wow, like, I can't believe my kid is 10. So just having gratitude for that.
I wasn't there, and that seems like it's a time flew.
It really does. Like, it's crazy that it's been a decade that I've been a mom. That's insane. So a lot of gratitude for that. And then also just, I just love working with my clients and helping them clear trauma so that they can grow their businesses. There is such this like direct correlation between clearing trauma and then just being super clear on who you are, what you're meant to offer, your unique way of working with clients. Like, I love seeing that direct correlation and seeing the way that it creates so much momentum in my clients. And every day I have gratitude for that because it's my favorite thing to do and my favorite thing to talk about.
Yeah, those outcomes are everything. And I think it's interesting because the listening audience since the inception of this podcast has generally been female bent more, we got like about 70 females, but and I think in the healing space, it's interesting that we are females, I believe, and women who identify as women are trying their hardest to address trauma. And it'll be interesting to see as we evolve further on how that's going to set us up long term to deal with however the earth is evolving. But I did cut you off there. There was one more gratitude there. You had 2, and I just don't want to cut you off on your gratitude.
Oh yeah. What else was I going to say? I think that's the biggest thing, is seeing those transformations. And then also, just my own journey in clearing my own trauma, and just like the way that keeps evolving and adding to my own understanding of it. And, it's just so important for me to continue to evolve my work and deepen my understanding of things. And I feel like I have so much gratitude for the continued evolution of that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Well, I really had a great time talking with you today, Alyse, and getting able to sort of break these really big ideas down. You went into such granular detail and gave really specific ideas of what people can work with and how they can start and how they can even just identify if this is somewhere they're struggling or this is like a guidepost to something bigger that they might want to address. So I really appreciate you doing your own work. I think we all end up becoming we all become alchemists in the end. We become the antidote to our own pain and our trauma, and we find a way then to use that to help other people. And I think you've done a really good job of that. So thank you for coming today, and thank you for being a part of my show.
Thank you. Thanks for having.
This podcast was written, directed, and produced by me, your host, Chris Izzy-Omata, in alignment with Light Casting. Music curated and created by Mr. Pixie. You can find I'm Awake Now What on all social media channels by searching IANW Podcast. Head over to your favorite podcast app and subscribe, download, rate, and review. Come back every Sunday to partake in a new and enlightening conversation. May you be filled with love and light until we meet again.